Jeanne sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone. It was 7:30 p.m. and she hadn't heard a word from Dan. He was working late again, like he had been almost every night for the past few months. Her fingers hovered over the screen, thinking about sending him another text. But she stopped herself. What was the point? He'd probably reply with the same message he always did. Busy talk later, but later never seemed to come. With a sigh, she put her phone down and leaned back in her chair. The house was quiet, except for the sound of paws padding softly across the hardwood floor. The dog, their golden retriever, came trotting over his tail, wagging like he was trying to cheer her up. Jeanne smiled, feeling a small bit of warmth rise in her chest. At least the dog was always happy to see her. "Hey, boy," she whispered, patting her leg. The dog quickly came to her side, nuzzling his head into her lap. Jeanne stroked his soft fur, her fingers trailing through his golden coat. "Looks like it's just us again tonight." She stood up and moved to the living room, the dog following right behind her, always eager to be close. Jeanne settled onto the couch and grabbed the remote, flipping through the channels without much interest. Everything on TV seemed boring. Or maybe it was just that she didn't have the energy to care lately. Everything felt like it was on repeat work. Home and endless nights alone. While Dan worked late, the dog jumped up beside her. Curling up next to her legs, he rested his head on her knee. Looking up at her with those big kind eyes, Jen smiled softly. "At least I've got you right," she said, rubbing his ears. It was a small comfort, but in that moment, the dog's company was the only thing that kept her from feeling completely alone. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jen and Dan had been married for 4 years, and in the beginning, everything had felt so easy. They used to spend hours talking, planning their future, going on spontaneous weekend trips. She could still remember how Dan used to surprise her with little things like a bouquet of flowers or her favorite coffee on a Saturday morning. But now it seemed like those moments were long gone. Dan's job had taken over his life, and Jen felt like she had slipped into the background, almost invisible as the weeks passed. The distance between them only seemed to grow. Dan would come home late, exhausted, barely saying more than a few words before heading to bed. Jeanne tried to talk to him, try to get him to open up about work, about why he was always so distracted, but their conversations never went anywhere. He just brushed her off, saying it was nothing or that things would calm down soon. But soon never seemed to come. One night, Jen was sitting on the couch, the dog at her side as always, when her phone buzzed. She picked it up, hoping it was Dan with some news that he'd be home early. But it was just another text from him saying, "I'll be late, don't wait up inside." Tossing the phone aside, she looked down at the dog who had his head on her lap, his tail thumping softly against the couch. "You know, you're starting to feel like the only one who's here for me anymore," she said quietly, feeling a lump forming in her throat. She stroked his fur, finding comfort in the simple act of being close to him. It's silly, isn't it? Talking to a dog like this. The dog didn't move, just lay there calm and steady, as if he was telling her it was okay. Jeanne started to rely on the dog more and more. When she came home from work, the first thing she did was greet him, hugging him close like he was the one constant in her life. Dan would come home late, barely glancing up from his phone, while Jen spent her evenings with the dog. They went for long walks, spent hours in the park. And sometimes Jen would talk to the dog as if he could understand everything she was going through. He couldn't respond, but he was always there, his loyal presence making her feel just a little less lonely. Then one Saturday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Jeanne was lying in bed, reading a book with the dog snuggled up beside her. Dan was supposed to be at the office working on some big project. At least that's what Jen thought. But suddenly, she heard the sound of the front door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. Dan was home early. She hadn't expected him for hours. She quickly sat up, her hands still resting on the dog's back. Moments later, Dan appeared in the bedroom doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked at Jen, then at the dog curled up next to her on the bed. "What's going on?" Dan asked, his voice sharp. Jen blinked, confused by his tone. "What do you mean?" she replied. Shifting slightly, Dan crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I come home early and I find you in bed with the dog." "What's that about?" Jen's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about how this might look to Dan. "Dan, it's nothing like that," she said quickly. He's been here for me, that's all for you." Dan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "He's a dog, Jen. You're acting like he's more than that." Jeanne felt her face flush with embarrassment, but also with frustration. Dan didn't get it. He didn't understand how lonely she had been, how much she had needed someone, anyone to be there for her when he wasn't. "You're never here, Dan," Jeanne said, her voice trembling. "You're always at work, and when you're home, you barely talk to me. I've been alone for months. And the dog, well, he's been the only one who's paid attention." Dan stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, what? You're saying I'm being replaced by the dog now?" Jeanne shook her head, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "It's not like that. I'm not trying to replace you. I didn't know what else to do. I was lonely and the dog was here." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension in the room thick and heavy. Dan ran a hand through his hair, looking away as if he was trying to make sense of everything. "This isn't normal, John," he finally said, his voice softer now. "You can't keep leaning on the dog like this. I know I haven't been around much, but this is not healthy." Jeanne bit her lip, trying to hold back her tears. "I know," she whispered, "but I didn't know how else to cope. You weren't here, and I didn't want to burden you with how I was feeling. So I just leaned on the dog." Dan sighed, sitting down on the edge of the bed. He looked tired, not just from work, but from everything that had been building between them. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" Jeanne wiped her eyes, her voice shaky. Because I didn't think you'd care. You've been so focused on work that it felt like I wasn't important anymore. Dan shook his head, looking down at the floor. I never meant for you to feel that way, he said quietly, but you're right. I've been distant. I thought I was doing the right thing by working hard, but I didn't realize how much I was neglecting us. Jeanne sat down beside him, her heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I just want us to feel close again. She whispered, I miss how we used to be. Dan reached for her hand, holding it tightly. I miss it too, he said softly. Maybe we can try to fix this. I know it's not going to be easy, but I don't want us to keep drifting apart. Jeanne nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. I don't want that either. In the weeks that followed, Jan and Dan started to rebuild what had been broken. They went to counseling, talked about their feelings, and slowly began to reconnect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Jen knew she couldn't keep using the dog as her emotional crutch. He was a dog, a wonderful companion, but he couldn't replace the human connection she needed with Dan. The dog still curled up beside her, sometimes still followed her around the house with his tail wagging. But now Jen made a conscious effort to lean on Dan more. They took time to be together, to talk, to be present in each other's lives. Again, Jen learned that love wasn't just about being together. During the good times, it was about sticking together even when things got hard. And though it had taken an unexpected bond with the dog to make her realize that she and Dan were finally finding their way back to each other, one small step at a time,